Hey everyone, this is That Guy in Hutch, Jason Probst, and you're listening to That Podcast in Hutch. I wanted to drop in and talk a little bit about some of what is going on with the podcast and what we're going to be doing going forward in the future. We're in a little bit of a transition period right now. I, as you know, come out of the legislative session at the end of May, and finally got that wrapped up, back in town and trying to get my head back into whatever normal life is going to look like for me for the rest of the year. But in the meantime, it's been a little bit of a challenge to get myself back on track with getting some guests lined up and making sure that I have interesting and compelling people to talk to who are willing to share their stories with me and with all of you. So bear with me for this week. And last week we missed an episode, but I want to make sure we stay on track on this and make sure that we have a podcast ready for you to listen to. But in the weeks coming up, I've got a few more guests lined up. I've gotten kind of back in my groove a little bit, and I have a couple of people that I think you're going to be very interested in hearing from in the coming weeks. Now, for this week's episode, I'm going to do something that we haven't done before. Usually, if I promote another podcast, it's part of the Salt City Sound Network, and it's a podcast that produced there. But this week, I had an opportunity to visit with Nick Sowers and Nate Hiatt. And they have a podcast put together called the Higher Points. And it's I had a great time visiting with them. We sat down in their studio at the High Point Pharms CBD store at the corner of 4th and Main. And if you haven't dropped in there, it's probably worth your doing. It's a pretty interesting store. They have a lot of good products in there. And I think too, it's important to know, as you see a lot of things come up, I hear advertisements all the time for CBD oil and different CBD products, but this is a group of people who are producing this right here in Reno County. They've done a lot of research and a lot of work to stand up a good operation. And they're actually from my hometown in Nickerson, and they're working this out there, but they have a shop down there on 4th and Main, and I'd recommend you go in and talk to them. They're great people, and they're very happy to explain their product and all the work and all the thought that goes into it. But for the podcast, this week, I was going to reference their podcast called The Higher Points. I got to sit down with Nick and Nate, and we just kind of ran the gamut on what we talked about. They asked me just generally about how I got into public service and how I got into serving in the legislature. We went through that. We talked a little bit about the legislative process and how some of those things play out and some of the dynamics that kind of maybe get in the way of good policy and some of the things that drive other policies. I think if you take a shot and listen to it, I think you'll enjoy that podcast. And I really hope to have those guys on That Guy in Hutch sometime and on that podcast in Hutch, because I think having them come in and talk about what they do will be really interesting. One thing that I found particularly interesting in talking with Nate and Nick is Nick is in law enforcement, and he's a very big proponent of CBD and legalization. And Nate, of course, they farm and produce their hemp products there. And so I thought that was an interesting combination to get those two different perspectives together in the same room and hear what they had to say. So this week, That Podcast in Hutch doesn't have its own original content like I normally like, but what I am going to do is send you over to the Higher Points, and you can look up their website. It's just thehigherpoints.com, and there it has links to everywhere you can get the podcast. And they do great work, and you'll find my episode on there, but I'd encourage you to peruse around a little bit, because they have a lot of other different episodes with a wide range of people that they talk to. And I think you'll find that episode pretty interesting. So again, it's thehigherpoints.com. It's the Higher Points podcast, and it's with Nick Sowers and with Nate Hiatt. And this week they were nice enough to have me on as their guest, and I'm glad that they did, and I really enjoyed the conversation. And if you go over and check them out, I hope you'll enjoy it too. In the meantime, keep checking back. Make sure you stay subscribed to That Podcast in Hutch. Make sure you rate and like us and get our information out there, because we really, want to grow the audience. We want to make sure more people know about us. And I think the more people who are listening, I just think it's a good way to share stories about our community and about our state. So with that, I encourage you to go check out this podcast. We had a lot of fun with it, and I think you'll have a lot of fun listening to it. Take care.
A Salt City Sound production.